Testing, test. Oh yes, coming, coming. Yeah, yes. See, I even use the signal indicator. Yeah. It was difficult, but I pulled it off. Yeah. Anyway, well, Brother Frank, would you feel comfortable praying us in? Mhm. Well, this is kind of nice that here at Highland Village we're extending the Valentine's Day into the Valentine's Day weekend. So for those couples that are staying after church today, I hope you all have a good time. And for those of us who will be on the serving team, we will do our best to make it a a nice time. We'll try not to spill anything. Okay, you never know sometimes. Anyway, we are in continuing our tour of Acts, and I am acting as your tour guide. We are still in chapter 16, and we are Paul has embarked on his second, what we know of as his second missionary tour. Uh, and last week we saw where Paul was once again on the Asia Minor mainland, and he intended to go back and touch base with all the churches that he had established, as well as touch base with go into some new territory and create establish some churches there. And yet he found himself blocked by God. God was basically sending a message: "Don't go there." And he would try another place, and God would say, "No, don't go there either." And then uh, essentially, Paul was finally and his companions, Luke and Silas and Timothy, are with him. Um, they're in a port city called Troas. They're on the tip of, I think, the Mediterranean, and Paul has the vision. A man who appears to be a man from Macedonia, what part of modern day Greece. Uh, Luke doesn't describe how Paul knew this was a Macedonian man, but he just knew. And the man from Macedonia says, "Come to our place, come over here and help us." And so that's the sign from Paul interprets that as a sign from God. Basically, Paul, this is where I want you to go. And I think each of us in our lives has probably seen God work in that way, where uh, there are doors that seem to be closed, especially doors that we thought, hey, this is a great opportunity. This is definitely where what I want to do or where I need to be, and doesn't work out for one reason or another. And yet we've heard so many times, and I think we've probably seen it uh, exemplified in our lives, where God closes a door, He opens another one, and this is definitely what's happening here. Because by going to Macedonia, uh, the gospel, the message of the gospel, continues to expand. Paul is now in what we think of today as part of modern day Europe. And so they, in Macedonia, they wind up in the city of Philippi, which Luke describes in verse 12 as a Roman colony. Of course, everywhere you go in this first century day and time, it's pretty much part of the Roman Empire. The Romans rule pretty much everything, every known part of the planet. And that includes Macedonia, that includes Philippi, a Roman colony, and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. So it is a happening town, a bustling city. And it's bustling in every way except there's no synagogue. How do we know this? Well, when Paul goes to look for the synagogue, it ain't there. And that says something about there is an absence, a near absence, if not total absence, of Jewish men, because in order for there to be a synagogue, there has to be at least 10 Jewish men to form that. No 10 men, no synagogue. So Paul searches about for a plan B. He finds out about a place of worship, very informal. It's down by the river, and there Paul and his companions find a lady by the name of Lydia. She is a dealer in purple cloth, which means that she would be the equivalent of, say, she runs the local jewelry store, or she would run the local Mercedes-Benz or Cadillac dealership. To be a dealer in purple cloth basically means that you are dealing with a very elite, very wealthy audience and clientele, which means that Lydia, probably herself, is a woman of means. And so but she's also a God worshiper, as Luke describes her. Which is kind of a vague phrase, but basically it means that Lydia and her companions down at this location by the river believe that there is a greater God than the ones that are being honored, basically have their own little temples in the city. She's come to the conclusion that, well, the temples look nice and everybody says nice things, but they're idols. And what can you do with those? But there is a greater power out there, and there's got to be. I just feel it in my bones. I'm in search of it, and that search is answered by God, because Paul meets up with her. They have a visit. Paul preaches, and Luke says the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, and she and her household are baptized. And as a result of that, she invited Paul and his team to her house. She says, if you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house. And Paul and his group agree to. And so you see what is very likely the first church to be established in Europe, which is very interesting. The gospel continues to spread. It is spreading worldwide, as they know the world to exist at that time. Luke's story continues. It doesn't stop there in terms of their visit in Philippi. He continues in verse 16. Once, when we were going to the place of prayer, place where we were worshiping, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune telling. This is interesting. A spirit of fortune telling, as very likely this is something I think we can safely conclude this is a demonic spirit. This is an ungodly spirit, even though Luke says she followed Paul and the rest of us shouting, These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved. Well, what could possibly be wrong with that? She's telling the truth. She is identifying Paul for who he is, and normally that wouldn't be a problem. Hey, yeah, I'm an ambassador for God and for Jesus. Nothing wrong with that. I got a few things to say about that. If you're interested, that'd be a great setup. Well, if had she just done this once, maybe twice, maybe 5 times or whatever, hey, no big deal. But apparently, she keeps it up. It is a constant thing. Luke says she followed Paul around shouting and not just suggesting. She's not just poking somebody on the shoulder and saying, hey, see that guy? He preaches the word of God. She's shouting. She's probably screaming at the top of her voice, maybe. It may be that while Paul is preaching a sermon, talking to another person, reasoning with them, right in the big middle, just as Paul's about to make a point in his discussion, there she goes. These men are so on. These are servants of the Most High God. Interrupts him. It just, after a while, if this happens to you, if you have someone who is constantly stepping on your lines, if you're talking to someone, if they're getting in the way, even if they feel like they're trying to help, it gets on your nerves eventually. It's kind of like, thank you for your help and your interest and so forth, but you don't need to do that. Nothing was going to deter this woman from screaming at the top of her voice about who Paul was. And after a while, it stops being a nice little thing and it starts becoming a nuisance when it goes on time after time after time after time, which apparently it is, because Luke says she kept this up for many days. Until finally, Paul became so annoyed, and as we know Paul, he's this mild-mannered man who just sort of suffers in silence and suffers fools gladly and just puts up with no. What we know of Paul is that he is very outspoken. He says what's on his mind more often than not, and Paul has a temper. Like, he's human, just like the rest of us. Paul finally snaps. It's like, okay, I'm going to do something about this. And he does. He becomes so annoyed that he turned around and said to the Spirit, he speaks not to the woman, but the Spirit inside her that is running her and running her life. He says to the Spirit, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her. And Luke says, at that moment, at that very hour. Now, your translation may say, at that very hour. It doesn't mean it took an hour for the Spirit to come out. I'm sure what Luke meant in the original Greek was the Spirit came out. The Spirit left her immediately. Now she had it. Now she doesn't. Suddenly, the Spirit that has been driving her behavior, driving her to follow Paul around and to interrupt and to scream about who he was, that Spirit's gone. And with the disappearance of the Spirit is this supposed fortune-telling talent she had, apparently she was at the behest of this group of men, maybe women, who shopped her around and basically said, hey, if you really want to know what the weather's going to be like, or how your dinner date is going to turn out, or what your business is, how it's going to perform in the next fiscal year or whatever, talk to her because she can give you the goods. Excuse me. And maybe it was all true. Maybe it was a lot of hogwash, but she was supposedly able to prophesy the future, and her owners charged a modest fee per consultation, and great source of passive income. Hey, if she was popular enough, they didn't have to have a daytime job. They just kind of held back and, shopped her around, collected the cash. Life is good until Paul orders the Spirit to leave her. When the Spirit leaves her, so does this gift of prophecy. And absolutely, yeah. Yes. Yes. Hey, this is a great way to attract a new audience. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let her annoy Paul because something good may come of that. Well, something good did come, but not to the poor woman's owners. Uh, you know, and they probably figure out soon enough that, hey, tell me something in the future. I don't know. I can't do that. I don't have that gift anymore. It's gone. When Paul told that spirit to leave the premises, and it doesn't take long for them to figure out, hey, there's a change in this woman. She can't foretell the future anymore. What are we going? Our gold mine here is gone. What are we going to do? Well, they get angry. And Luke says when her owners realized that their hope of making money, turning a profit on this woman was gone, hey, we might actually have to go down the salt mine and work for a living. They get angry, and what do? Well, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. Why the marketplace? Because as we know, in this culture, this day and age, all business, whether it was governmental business or private business, all business took place in the marketplace. That's if you needed to, buy new wheel rims for your chariot, that's where you went. If you had to pay a parking ticket for the chariot, that's where you went. That kind of thing. That's where the local authorities were. So okay, yeah, let's they did dirty to us. Paul and Silas did. We're going to do dirty to them. So they grab them by the scruff of the necks, pin them down, drag them into the marketplace. And they brought them before the magistrates, the local officials, and they said, "These men are Jews." It should tell you something about the relative lack of Jewish men, that they, for whatever reason, they could identify someone and identify them in a negative way as Jewish. It may possibly indicate the level of bigotry in that city toward Jewish people. These men are Jews. They're throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice. Not only do they point the finger at Paul and Silas, but they invoke patriotism. If there had been a flag there, they probably would have wrapped themselves in that flag. Hey, yeah, we're basically Greeks, but we're Romans too. We're proud Roman citizens, and these unpatriotic Jewish men are trying to pressure us to abandon our proud Roman tradition and customs. I find that intolerable. How about you? Well, they whip up the crowd. Luke says, verse 22, the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas. And the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods in public. This was, there's nothing too dainty about this. That would have been bad enough, stripped and beaten. Now, with rods, it sounds like maybe this is not so bad as being beaten with the leather thongs with the embedded nails and bones in them, but it's bad enough. They get beaten up pretty badly, because Luke said they were severely flogged. Not and then even then they were not finished. Paul and Silas were thrown into prison. Yuck. And how Luke and Timothy escaped all this, Luke doesn't mention, but somehow Luke and Timothy stay out of it. Paul and Silas are the ones who bear the brunt of all this bad behavior. They're beaten, they're stripped, they're beaten, they're thrown into prison. And what we know about Roman prisons is that it was no holiday to be in jail in the Roman Empire. It was pretty bad. Well, and that was on top of the fact that they were in some kind of physical pain and discomfort because of the beating they'd taken. They probably had at least, there were welts and bruises on their back, maybe cuts, depending on how sharp those rods were. But what they basically do, the Romans had a particular view about jail. You didn't stay there very long. There were two reasons for you to be in jail if you were in a Roman prison. You were awaiting trial or you were awaiting execution. If you were awaiting trial, one of the goals was to try to force some kind of confession out of you, even if you were innocent. So the way you were imprisoned in the prison was you were obviously in chains, and sometimes your feet were in the stockades. Sometimes they would string you up in a way that would be as uncomfortable as possible, so that after a while, when you were in sufficient pain from being in this contorted position, uh, the thought was, well, maybe he'll be ready to confess. Maybe he'll be ready to confess to anything. Civil rights, not an issue here. If you were to march in and say, I'm from the ACLU, they would have said, ACL who? And they probably would have thrown you in jail as well. The more lenient, the more liberal Roman judges, if they took pity on you, they wouldn't put you in jail. They would just have you executed. That was the safer, kinder, more loving thing to do in their view. Anyway, not fun. It's bad enough they're in jail, but the jailer, Luke says, was commanded to guard them carefully. You know what that means. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks, no doubt with their legs cuffed in a way and in a position where they were anything but comfortable. And in the inner cell meant they were in pitch darkness. They probably couldn't even see. Paul and Silas probably couldn't even see each other. It was that dark. Well, here they are. And they've been stripped. They've been beaten. Obviously whatever wounds they have not been tended to. They're beaten. They're bloody. They're in pitch darkness. I'm sure they're in several degrees of pain. They're in chains, and that's on top of the humiliation of having this been done in public. And what do you do when you're in a situation like that? Paul says to Silas, let's have a worship service. Not the first thing that would come on my mind. In fact, I probably wouldn't be in any condition to be, to start singing, sing and be happy. It just would not come naturally to me. But Paul says, let's do it. Silas agrees. So, verse 25, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. Well, what do you know? It was dark, it was messy, it was unsanitary, it was smelly, and you never knew who the person next to you was. It was, on top of all that, it was very secure. If you were, your arms were chained to the wall, your feet were in the stockades, there was a guard at the door. Uh, don't even think about escaping through the window. If they were in the inner cell, there was no window. They were as secure as they could be, and yet here, this massive earthquake. The doors fling open. The chains come loose. Everybody can escape. Everybody has an opportunity to escape, which would be a problem for the jailer. The jailer woke up, verse 27. When he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. Now, why would he kill himself? Hey, it was only an earthquake beyond his control. Well, there was a standing rule in Roman law and among the Roman soldiers and the jail keepers and so forth. This simple rule was this: if you were a guard guarding a prisoner and you allowed that that prisoner to escape, you suffered what the prisoner was going to be punished for. Now, if the prisoner was in jail for a speeding ticket, well, maybe you would get your chariot confiscated. But usually, if you were in jail, you were for something very serious, and more often and more likely than not, you were about to be executed, and in a very unhappy, harsh, and painful way. So this is what's going through the jailer's mind in an instant. There's been an earthquake. The jail is no longer secure. The doors have flung open. Everybody must have escaped. I'm toast. I know what's going to happen to me because there were some condemned prisoners in here. I'm going to get the death sentence here. So I might as well make it easy on myself and do the deed myself. So he's drawn his sword. He's about to kill himself. And Paul shouts, "Don't harm yourself. We're all here." Really? You got to be kidding me. Hey, get some lights in here. So the jailer called for lights. He rushed in, and yep, what Paul tells him is true. Yeah, the chains have fallen down. They've broken open. Everybody theoretically could rush that door and run out, but they're all there. They're all accounted for. So when the jailer sees what has happened, this is truly miraculous. So he fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, good sirs, men, what must I do to be saved?" He realized this was the act. This was a miraculous act. This was the act of a God that truly was out there, and a God much more powerful than any God he might be even faintly acquainted with. Paul, Silas, what do I need to do? I know I'm a sinful man. I'm getting a respite I don't deserve. I need to do something about my condition. What do I do? What must I do to be saved? And Paul and Silas replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all the others in his house. Jailer probably lived inside the building with his family or lived nearby, but at that hour of the night, the jailer took them, Paul and Silas. He washed their wounds, and then immediately he and all his household were baptized. The jailer brought him into his house, set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. So a very, very happy outcome. But hey, Paul and Silas are still, in the eyes of the local officials, they're still criminals. So apparently back to jail they go, at least until daylight. And then something else happens. The magistrates sent their officers. Your translation may read, they sent the police. They sent their officers to the jailer with the order, release those men. Obviously, there's been a change of heart. Well, maybe they don't need to be in jail. Yeah, they have suffered adequately for whatever they might have done, if they did anything. So this is good news. To the jailer, hey, it's good news on top of good news. Hey, I've been saved. I am a Christian. This is great. And hey, Paul and Silas, even better news. You're free. The magistrates will let you go. The magistrates have ordered that you and Silas be released. Now you can leave. Go in peace. If I were Silas or another member of Paul's party, I would say, this is great news, Paul. Let's get the heck out of Philippi. Yeah. While they're still in a good mood. Paul's not having it. You might guess. Paul, who would shout down a demonic spirit, is going to stare down and speak truth to power here. Paul said to the officers, verse 37, they beat us publicly without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now do they want to get rid of us quietly? I don't think so. Loose translation. Actually, he said, no, let them come themselves and escort us out. Now, Paul knows what he's doing here because he knows a little something about the law as Luke is about to explain to us here. Verse 38, the officers reported this to the magistrates. And when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, they panicked. They were alarmed. Why? Because Roman citizens under Roman law had very significant rights that would have prevented them being treated the way Paul and Silas was. A Roman citizen in good standing would never have been beaten publicly, let alone thrown in jail, let alone suffered all the other abuse that Paul and Silas were put through. What has happened here is that the magistrates, in treating Paul and Silas the way they did, had broken the law. What do you do when you break the law? Well, that's a different kettle of fish, because even though the magistrates themselves were very likely Roman citizens, if you break the Roman law, hey, it's all over. You can have anything done to you that Roman officials deem appropriate punishment. So the magistrates could have been thrown out of office. You guys disobeyed the law. You embarrassed, you insulted the Roman government. This cannot stand. You are no longer, as of 1201 today, you are no longer in office. You are no longer in power. They could have wound up receiving the very same treatment they had dished out to Paul and Silas. They could have been beaten. They could have been thrown in jail. See how you like it. No wonder they were nervous. Nervous to the point of being alarmed, to the point of panicking. Look at their response here. They go to Paul and Silas. They go to the prison. Paul said, we're hanging here until those dudes come over and escort us out, which is exactly what the magistrates do. They came to appease Paul and Silas. I would have loved to have been there just to see what they actually said to Paul and Silas. Maybe they actually said, oops, our bad, we're so sorry. Maybe not, because you know how people in power or positions of authority are. They'll do anything other than admit wrongdoing, but they'll dance their way around it. This is probably what they did with Paul and Silas. Well, I'm glad you're taking it so well, and I hope you've enjoyed the visit here. in our fair city, and I hope you've had a good look at what prison life is like. Uh, have a wonderful day, but why don't you lay down? Yes, we've mistakes were made. We've all learned a lesson here. Yes. And, hey, when what can we do here? Well, I mean, it's people. People will make mistakes. And golly, you can if you think hard enough, you probably made one or two yourself. So yeah, we're all in the same boat. But you have a good day, and here they're pushing Paul and Silas not only out of jail, but they're pushing them toward the city limits. Like the trail out of town is right there. You know, they can't get Paul and Silas out of town fast enough because the sooner they leave, they figure problem solved. Then they won't be. None of this will come back on us. But so they talk to Paul and Silas, and I like the way Luke mentions this. They or phrases it. They requested them to leave the city. Well, Paul and Silas eventually do, but they got business to take care of. Verse 40, after Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house where they met with their brethren, and they encouraged them. Basically said, "Hey, we spent a rough night in jail and we got beaten up, but it's all good. We're still walking, we're still functioning, you know, God, and we actually converted a household in the process. God is good." And so with that, they encouraged their Christian brothers and sisters. And then before leaving, before we leave chapter 16, we need to notice a language change here. We talked last week about how Luke's narrative had gone from third person to first person, indicating that he had joined Paul's team. Note here, last verse, where the tense changes again. It's back to third person, which means that Paul will continue his journey, but at least for this leg of the journey, apparently Luke is not with him. But Luke will be informed of the story, obviously, because the story will carry on. But Paul is going to continue in his journey throughout Macedonia and regions thereof. As we get into chapter 17, if you will, read that. That'll be the basis of our text for our lesson for next Sunday. Chapter 17 is very interesting because there's a passage that, for those of us who went to Abilene Christian, there's a certain passage there that gets read at the beginning of every school year, or at least back in the day. So if you will, read chapter 17, and Lord willing, we'll meet back here next Sunday for our lesson. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. I hope you got something out of the lesson. Have a great week. Stay warm because apparently we're going to get at least another cold snap. It's February. It's winter. What can I say? Anyway, pray for rain, and we'll see you next Sunday. Thanks. Don't you know?